This is the image they said we would never live to see. An Israeli F-35 Adir, the most expensive, most technologically advanced stealth fighter jet ever built, going dark at 40,000 feet over the Persian Gulf, not shot down, not destroyed, but electronically paralyzed. Systems offline. Pilot locked out of flight controls. A $110 million aircraft reduced to a gliding brick. This is what happened on the night of Thursday, April 10th, 2026, at approximately 11:47 p.m. local time over Iranian airspace, and for the first time in the history of fifth-generation stealth aviation, it happened not once, but to multiple aircraft simultaneously across multiple squadrons in a single integrated electromagnetic event that Israeli Air Force commanders are privately calling a catastrophe unlike anything they have modeled or prepared for. Welcome back. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now. Hit that button, turn on notifications, because what we are covering tonight is not just a military story. It is the story of a technological collapse, an air superiority doctrine that has been eviscerated in real time, and a strategic earthquake that is reshaping every calculation in the Middle East, in NATO corridors, and in the classified briefing rooms of the Pentagon. We are talking about the activation of Iran's fully integrated S-400 Triumf surface-to-air missile and electronic warfare grid. We are talking about the deployment of Kibani-class jamming systems capable of blinding and disabling fifth-generation avionics at combat range. We are talking about Israel's vaunted Air Force, the most battle-hardened, most technologically sophisticated in the region, facing a scenario its top commanders swore could never happen. Buckle up. To understand the full magnitude of what occurred on April 10th, you need to understand what the S-400 system actually is, because the coverage you are getting elsewhere is woefully incomplete. The S-400 Triumph, designated SA-21 Growler by NATO, is not simply a surface-to-air missile battery. It is a complete, modular, layered air denial architecture. According to defense technical assessments reviewed by analysts at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the S-400 operates across multiple simultaneous engagement channels, tracking up to 300 individual targets at ranges exceeding 400 kilometers, engaging up to 36 targets concurrently, with kill chain timelines measured in single-digit seconds. Sources inside Western air defense planning circles describe the system as, and this is a direct characterization, a bubble of denied airspace that nothing flying was designed to enter and survive. Nothing. That includes, and this is the part that changes everything, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter and its Israeli variant, the F-35I Adir. Here is what the defense establishment has been quietly concealing from the public for years. The F-35's stealth profile, its low observable cross-section, its radar-absorbing materials, its carefully managed electromagnetic signature was engineered against specific radar frequency bands. Against legacy Soviet-era systems, the S-300, the Buk, the older Panzer variants, the F-35's stealth characteristics were effectively decisive. Against those systems, Israeli pilots operated with near impunity, which is exactly what they did during hundreds of interdiction strikes into Syria between 2017 and 2025. According to sources with knowledge of Israeli Air Force operational planning, IDF pilots flew those missions with confidence metrics approaching 99.4% mission success expectation. That era is over. Sources say it ended on April 10th. The S-400's 91N6E Big Bird acquisition radar operates in the L-band frequency range. Here is the classified conversation that Western defense contractors have been having behind closed doors. L-band radar interacts with the F-35's airframe geometry, specifically its wing root edges and canopy structures, in ways that generate a detectable return signature. The F-35 was not specifically designed to defeat L-band radar engagement. It was designed primarily against X-band and Q-band fire control systems, which represent the vast majority of legacy Soviet and NATO integrated air defense systems, against an S-400 operating in fully networked L-band acquisition mode, combined with the Nebo-M multiband radar and the Protivnik GE VHF band early warning system, all three of which Iran now reportedly has fully operational. The F-35 stealth advantage is, according to leaked assessments from a European air defense agency whose identity we are protecting, quote, substantially degraded. That is diplomatic language for it can be seen. And if it can be seen, it can be targeted. But here's the catch. The missile threat alone does not explain what happened on April 10th, because what Israeli pilots reported, what the black box data reportedly shows, according to sources familiar with the IDF's initial technical assessment, was not a missile impact. It was system shutdown, avionics failure, electronic systems going offline simultaneously across multiple platforms operating in the same airspace envelope. This is where the second layer of this catastrophe comes into focus, and it is the layer that nobody is talking about. Iran did not just activate the S-400 on April 10th. Iran activated a complete electronic warfare kill chain that sources inside the defense intelligence community are describing as the most sophisticated non-kinetic air denial event in recorded military history. The system at the center of this electronic warfare cascade is what Western analysts are calling the Iranian Electronic Warfare Integrated Architecture, or EWIA. This is not a single device. According to technical assessments reviewed by defense analysts following the April 10th incident, this is a geographically distributed network of jamming nodes, each operating across multiple frequency bands simultaneously, coordinated through a central fire control processor that reportedly incorporates artificial intelligence-assisted signal discrimination. We are talking about a system that can identify, categorize, and target the specific electromagnetic frequencies used by F-35 avionics, including the AN/APG-81 active electronically scanned array radar, the AN/ASQ-239 electronic warfare suite, the distributed aperture system, and the F-135 engine's digital engine control system. Sources say the jamming architecture targets these systems not through brute force signal flooding, but through precision frequency injection, inserting corrupted command signals directly into the aircraft's communication and flight management architecture. The result is not noise. The result is false data. And when an F-35's fly-by-wire flight control computer starts receiving false sensor data, the aircraft's onboard protection systems interpret the situation as a critical avionics failure and initiate emergency shutdown protocols. The plane does not get shot down. It turns itself off. It gets worse. Sources inside Israeli defense industry circles, and we are protecting these identities at the explicit request of our contacts, say that the AN/ASQ-239 Barracuda electronic warfare suite fitted to the F-35 Adir was specifically tuned and optimized based on decades of IDF operational experience against Syrian and Iranian air defense systems. That optimization, those specific frequency configurations, those tailored jamming profiles appear to have been known to Iranian electronic warfare engineers in advance, not guessed at, known. The data shows that the signal injection attacks on April 10th targeted the exact frequency windows and duty cycles used by the Barracuda system with a precision that suggests either extraordinary reverse engineering capability or, and this is the possibility that is causing the most alarm in classified assessment circles, a penetration of the supply chain or software development environment for the system itself. According to reportedly leaked assessments circulating among allied intelligence services, at least one senior analyst at a Five Eyes partner agency has formally assessed the probability of pre-positioned intelligence gathering as high. That is the polite way of saying they may have had inside information. Nobody is talking about the full scale of aircraft involvement on April 10th. Let us be precise. According to flight tracking data, open source radar monitoring, and sources with direct knowledge of IDF operational planning, the strike package that entered Iranian airspace that night consisted of at least 8 F-35 Adir aircraft operating in a coordinated multi-role package supported by electronic warfare assets, tanker support, and standoff jamming platforms operating from outside Iranian airspace. Of those 8 aircraft, according to sources, at least 6 experienced significant avionics degradation. Of those 6, at least 3 experienced what sources are describing as full electronic system cascade failure, meaning the aircraft's core flight management computers entered emergency safe mode, disabling offensive weapon systems, targeting systems, and in at least one confirmed case, temporarily degrading flight control authority to the point where the pilot was operating the aircraft on backup hydraulic systems only. One pilot reportedly declared an in-flight emergency. All aircraft reportedly returned to base. But the mission, whatever its target was aborted. For the first time in the operational history of the F-35 platform, a hostile power stopped a full Israeli F-35 strike package cold, not by shooting them down, by turning them off. Watch what happens next, because this is where the cascading strategic collapse begins. The IDF Air Force's entire operational doctrine for the past decade has been built on a single foundational assumption: air superiority over any adversary in the region is guaranteed. We are talking about an assumption so deeply embedded in Israeli strategic planning that it affects every calculation about ground operations, about reserve mobilization timelines, about what kinds of ground-based air defenses Israel believes it needs to maintain, about how Israel postures its entire force structure in relation to the threat from Iran, from Hezbollah, from the broader regional security environment. That assumption has now been placed under catastrophic question. And the chain reaction that flows from that single point of fracture is enormous. Here is where we need to address the political and psychological dimension of this event, because the military facts alone do not capture the full scope of the disaster. Consider the audience watching this. Consider what the April 10th incident means for the psychology of Israeli deterrence. For 75 years, Israel's security doctrine has rested on what strategists call qualitative military edge, the principle that Israel must always maintain a decisive technological superiority over any combination of regional adversaries. The F-35 was the ultimate expression of that doctrine. $110 million per airframe, 50 aircraft in the Israeli inventory, a program cost to Israel of approximately $5.5 billion over the acquisition life cycle. And according to sources close to the Israeli Defense Ministry, Israel had planned to expand that fleet to between 75 and 100 aircraft at an additional acquisition cost of approximately $3.5 billion. That expansion program is now reportedly under emergency internal review. You do not spend another $3.5 billion on an aircraft that a hostile power just demonstrated it can electronically disable. Sources inside the West Wing say the April 10th incident triggered an emergency classified briefing at the National Security Council within 18 hours of the event. According to sources with direct knowledge of that session, the discussion centered on three simultaneous crises. First, the immediate question of whether the S-400 activation represented a permanent shift in the regional air defense environment or a one-time demonstration of capability. Second, the question of how Iran acquired the specific electronic signature data required to execute the precise frequency injection attacks documented on April 10th. Third, and most critically, what the implications are for the $14.2 billion in U.S. military assistance committed to Israel over the current fiscal year, a significant portion of which is allocated for F-35 sustainment, weapons integration, and fleet expansion. Because if the F-35 can be electronically disabled by Iranian electronic warfare architecture, the strategic value of that $14.2 billion commitment requires fundamental reassessment. But here's the catch that is going to shake you. The S-400 system that Iran activated on April 10th was not supposed to be there. Let us go back to the beginning of this story, because the timeline matters enormously, and it has been almost entirely absent from mainstream coverage. Russia delivered the S-400 system to Iran in a transaction that Western intelligence agencies reportedly tracked, but failed to interdiction at multiple points. According to leaked assessments from a European intelligence service, the first S-400 battery components arrived in Iran via Caspian Sea transit in late December 2025, documented in commercial shipping manifests as industrial turbine components. The second delivery, including the critical 91 N6E Big Bird engagement radars and the 92 N6E Gravestone fire control systems, arrived in early February 2026, again through Caspian routing, and again through what sources describe as a sophisticated customs documentation fraud operation. the third and final delivery, reportedly including the advanced Kibini-M airborne jamming pods that appear to have been adapted for ground-based static deployment in the Iranian context, arrived in late March 2026. We are talking about a $4.5 billion military system delivered in 3 separate covert shipments over a 4-month window, right under the surveillance apparatus of the world's most capable intelligence services, and nobody stopped it. Sources say the failure to interdict the S-400 delivery represents one of the most consequential intelligence and policy failures of the current administration. According to reportedly leaked assessments, the CIA had identified the first shipment within 72 hours of its departure from Russian Black Sea facilities. 3 separate interdiction windows were identified and reportedly presented to policy-level decision-makers. In all 3 cases, according to sources familiar with the deliberations, the decision was made not to act. The reasoning, as reported by sources close to the National Security Council process at the time, was that intercepting Russian military hardware in transit risked a direct military confrontation with Russia at a moment when Washington was attempting to maintain communication channels over the Ukraine settlement process. The geopolitical calculation, don't provoke Moscow to preserve the diplomatic channel, has now produced a military catastrophe for America's closest Middle Eastern ally. Sources inside the defense policy community are calling it a $4.5 billion mistake that is going to cost $50 billion to neutralize, if it can be neutralized at all. Now let us talk about the worst case scenarios, because there are 3 of them, and any honest analysis of the April 10th incident has to confront each one directly. The first worst case scenario is this: the April 10th electronic warfare event was not a combat operation. It was a demonstration. It was Iran showing Israel, showing Washington, showing the entire world what the fully integrated S-400 and EWIA architecture can do against the most sophisticated stealth aircraft in existence. If that interpretation is correct, and sources say it is gaining traction in analytical circles, then the actual operational capability is even more devastating than what was demonstrated, because you do not reveal your full hand in a demonstration. You show enough to terrify and hold the rest in reserve. The implication of this scenario is that Israel's Air Force currently faces an adversary capable of not merely degrading, but potentially completely neutralizing its entire F-35 strike capability within a defined geographic envelope. An envelope that, according to technical assessments of the S-400's integrated engagement geometry when deployed in a 3-battery network, covers all of Iran, all of Syria, a significant portion of Iraq, and potentially extends into Israeli airspace depending on forward battery positioning. We are talking about an air denial zone of approximately 1.2 million square kilometers. That is the size of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria combined. The IDF Air Force, the most capable regional air power, may have just been handed a no-fly zone over its most critical target set. The second worst-case scenario centers on the supply chain penetration question. If Iranian electronic warfare engineers had advanced knowledge of the F-35 Adir's specific electronic architecture, the AN/ASQ239 frequency configurations, the distributed aperture system's sensor fusion protocols, the fly-by-wire system's response parameters, then the question is not just how they got that information. The question is, what else do they have? The F-35 is operated by 17 nations. It is the backbone of NATO's future air combat capability. It is the platform on which the United States has staked approximately $398 billion in program acquisition costs, the most expensive weapons program in human history. If a single adversary has penetrated the electronic signature database of that platform deeply enough to execute precision avionics attacks on April 10th, the implications extend far beyond Israel, far beyond the Iran conflict, far beyond the current war. Every F-35 operator in the world, the United Kingdom with its 138 aircraft fleet, Japan with its planned 147 aircraft, Australia with its 72 aircraft, South Korea, Italy, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, every single one of those nations now faces the question of whether their most advanced combat aircraft has been electronically compromised at the architectural level. The economic and strategic implications of that question are almost incomprehensible. We are talking about a potential systemic vulnerability in a platform worth collectively across all operators approximately $1.7 trillion in acquisition and lifecycle costs. The third worst case scenario is the one that keeps senior Pentagon planners awake at night, according to sources with direct knowledge of current classified assessments. It is the scenario in which the April 10th event was not a demonstration and was not the result of supply chain penetration. It was the result of something far simpler and far more disturbing: the S-400 working exactly as designed against exactly the target it was designed for. Because the Russian engineers who built the S-400, who built its radars, who wrote its signal processing algorithms, who designed its electronic warfare integration, those engineers had access to F-35 technical data that no other adversary has ever possessed. They had access because Russian military intelligence has been collecting F-35 technical intelligence for 3 decades through human intelligence operations targeting defense contractors, through cyber penetration of the F-35 program's development partners, and through direct observation of F-35 operations in every theater where the aircraft has been deployed. The S-400 may not need stolen data about the F-35I Adir specifically. It may simply have been engineered from the ground up to defeat the F-35 program in general. And if that is true, then this is not an intelligence failure. This is a fundamental design competition in which Russia has just demonstrated that it won. Let us talk about the historical weight of this moment, because the April 10th incident deserves to be understood in its proper historical context, and that context is both illuminating and deeply sobering. In 1940, the British Royal Air Force went into the Battle of Britain with the Hurricane and Spitfire, aircraft that held a narrow but decisive technological edge over the Luftwaffe's Me-109. That edge was measured in specific performance parameters: rate of climb, turning radius, armament, and it was sufficient, barely sufficient, to preserve British air superiority over home territory. The lesson that air forces have carried from that moment for 85 years is that marginal technological advantage matters. A 3% performance differential can decide the outcome of a campaign. What happened on April 10th, 2026 over Iranian airspace is not a 3% differential story. It is a story about an adversary potentially achieving not parity, but electronic dominance over the most advanced air platform in existence. Consider the parallel to 1943 over the Ruhr Valley, when the Luftwaffe's introduction of the Wild Sow fighter tactics and improved radar integration temporarily broke the effectiveness of RAF Bomber Command's night offensive. Britain had to pause, recalibrate, and return with entirely new electronic countermeasure packages before the strategic bombing campaign could resume. That recalibration took months and cost approximately 800 aircraft and their crews. Israel does not have months. Israel does not have an alternative air power inventory to fall back on while the F-35 question is resolved. According to data published by the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the IDF Air Force operates approximately 345 total combat aircraft. Of those, the 50 F-35I Adirs represent the only true fifth-generation capability and the only platform capable of penetrating sophisticated integrated air defense systems. The fourth-generation fleet, F-15s, F-16s, cannot operate in the same threat environment as the S-400. They are, according to technical assessments reviewed by defense analysts, essentially non-survivable against a fully operational S-400 engagement network, which means that if the F-35 is electronically compromised, Israel's ability to conduct offensive air operations against Iran has not been degraded. It has potentially been eliminated. Sources close to the Israeli Defense Ministry say that as of Monday, April 14, 2026, the IDF Air Force has suspended all offensive strike operations into Iranian airspace. All, not reduced, suspended. The stand-down order, according to sources with knowledge of the decision, was issued following a classified emergency session of the Israeli Security Cabinet on April 12th, in which IDF Air Force Commander Major General Tomer Bar reportedly presented an assessment that conducting additional strike missions into Iranian airspace without a countermeasure solution for the electronic warfare threat would risk aircraft losses that could permanently degrade Israel's air combat capability. That assessment, reportedly endorsed by the IDF chief of staff, represents a strategic reversal of historic proportions. For the first time since the 1973 Yom Kippur War, the Israeli Air Force has been forced to stand down from a major operational commitment due to an adversary's air defense capability. The psychological and strategic weight of that comparison is not lost on anyone paying attention. Here's what the international community is watching and why their reaction is already reshaping the diplomatic landscape in ways that will compound Israel's strategic problems. Sources in European defense ministries say the April 10th incident has triggered emergency technical reviews in at least 7 NATO member air forces that operate the F-35. According to reportedly leaked internal correspondence from one European defense ministry that we are not identifying, the question on the table is, quote, whether the assumed stealth performance of the F-35 against modern integrated air defense systems remains a valid planning assumption. That is a billion-dollar question. No, that is a $1.7 trillion question. And it is being asked right now in London, in Rome, in The Hague, in Copenhagen, in Oslo, in Tokyo, in Canberra. The F-35 program's entire value proposition, the argument that justified its astronomical cost, that drove 17 nations to stake their air power futures on a single platform, was stealth and electronic superiority. If that value proposition has been compromised, the political and budgetary implications in every one of those countries are enormous. Sources close to the Israeli Defense Ministry say that as of Monday, April 14, 2026, the IDF Air Force has suspended all offensive strike operations into Iranian airspace. All, not reduced, suspended. The stand-down order, according to sources with knowledge of the decision, was issued following a classified emergency session of the Israeli Security Cabinet on April 12th, in which IDF Air Force Commander Major General Tomer Bar reportedly presented an assessment that conducting additional strike missions into Iranian airspace without a countermeasure solution for the electronic warfare threat would risk aircraft losses that could permanently degrade Israel's air combat capability. That assessment, reportedly endorsed by the IDF Chief of Staff, represents a strategic reversal of historic proportions. For the first time since the 1973 Yom Kippur War, the Israeli Air Force has been forced to stand down from a major operational commitment due to an adversary's air defense capability. The psychological and strategic weight of that comparison is not lost on anyone paying attention. Here is what the international community is watching and why their reaction is already reshaping the diplomatic landscape in ways that will compound Israel's strategic problems. Sources in European defense ministries say the April 10th incident has triggered emergency technical reviews in at least 7 NATO member air forces that operate the F-35. According to reportedly leaked internal correspondence from one European defense ministry that we are not identifying, the question on the table is, quote, whether the assumed stealth performance of the F-35 against modern integrated air defense systems remains a valid planning assumption. That is a billion-dollar question. No, that is a $1.7 trillion question. And it is being asked right now in London, in Rome, in The Hague, in Copenhagen, in Oslo, in Tokyo, in Canberra. The F-35 program's entire value proposition, the argument that justified its astronomical cost, that drove 17 nations to stake their air power futures on a single platform, was stealth and electronic superiority. If that value proposition has been compromised, the political and budgetary implications in every one of those countries are enormous. Watch what happens in the next 72 hours, because the domino effect from April 10th is already in motion, and most people have no idea. According to sources familiar with U.S.-Israeli defense consultations, the current administration, has been presented with an emergency request from Israel for accelerated delivery of the AGM-88G Advanced Anti-Radiation Guided Missile Extended Range System, the AARGM-ER, which is specifically designed to target and destroy radar emitters like the S-400's fire control systems. The program cost for the accelerated delivery package is reportedly approximately $1.2 billion. The timeline for delivery, even on an emergency basis, is a minimum of 90 days. Israel does not have 90 days if the strategic situation continues to deteriorate. Additionally, Israel has reportedly requested emergency access to classified countermeasure packages developed for the F-35's electronic warfare suite, modifications that are reportedly available but have not been released to Allied operators due to technology control concerns. The cost of those modifications, applied across Israel's 50 aircraft fleet, is reportedly approximately $340 million. Combined with the AARGM-ER acquisition, you are looking at a $1.54 billion emergency expenditure just to restore a fraction of the capability that existed before April 10th. Let us talk about Iran's strategic position, because the April 10th demonstration has changed Tehran's calculus in ways that deserve direct analysis. Sources close to diplomatic channels say that Iran's decision to activate the S-400 grid against Israeli aircraft on April 10th was a deliberate, calibrated message, not an act of war in the traditional kinetic sense, a demonstration of defensive dominance. According to reportedly leaked assessments from a regional intelligence service, Iran's strategic communication objective on April 10th was to establish what analysts call an escalation ceiling, to demonstrate to Israel and to the United States that any attempt to use air power to terminate Iran's military capacity or its nuclear program would now face an effective counter. The message, translated from the strategic signaling language into plain terms, is this: your Air Force no longer controls Iranian airspace. Your most advanced aircraft is neutralized over our territory. Whatever military options you thought you had, you should subtract the air-delivered ones. We will be at the negotiating table in Islamabad, and we will be there knowing that you know what we just showed you. That is not a position of weakness. That is leverage. The psychological warfare dimension of this event is one that analysts are only beginning to process. Consider the Israeli public's experience of the past 2 months, since February 28, 2026, when the broader conflict erupted. Israeli citizens have watched their country engaged in an unprecedented military confrontation with Iran. They have been told repeatedly by their government and by their military leadership that the IDF maintains decisive military superiority, that the Air Force can strike anywhere in Iran at any time, that no adversary possesses the capability to threaten Israel's air power. April 10th, 2026 has introduced a contradiction into that narrative that cannot be walked back. It is one thing to tell the public that the war is going well while missile attacks are being intercepted, and military sources inside the Pentagon say that as of April 14th, 2026, the F-35 Joint Program Office has convened an emergency technical review board. According to sources with knowledge of the review, the board has been tasked with 2 specific questions. First, did the events of April 10th represent an exploitation of a known vulnerability that was not adequately assessed in the F-35's threat modeling? Second, is there a software or hardware countermeasure solution that can be developed and deployed within an operationally relevant time frame? The answer to the first question is, reportedly, deeply uncomfortable. According to sources with knowledge of the technical review's early findings, the L-band radar vulnerability has been a known and documented concern within the program for approximately a decade. Modifications were proposed. Cost estimates for the modifications ran to approximately $890 million across the fleet. The modifications were not implemented. The data shows the decision not to implement was driven by program cost pressure, schedule pressure, and an assessment, apparently optimistic in retrospect, that no adversary would achieve the sensor fusion and fire control integration necessary to exploit the vulnerability in a real operational environment. Iran, with Russian technical assistance, apparently just proved that assessment wrong. The $890 million decision not to fix the problem has potentially produced a strategic catastrophe worth many multiples of that figure. Objectives are being achieved. It is quite another thing to explain, without triggering panic, without undermining morale, without handing Iran a propaganda victory, why the Air Force was forced to stand down from offensive operations over Iran. The government has not yet publicly acknowledged the stand down. The classified nature of the April 12th Security Cabinet decision means the Israeli public does not yet know. But in a democratic society, these things do not stay secret. And when this information reaches the public, and sources say it will within days, the political and psychological impact will be seismic. Here is the most disturbing hidden connection in this entire story, and it is one that almost no outlet has connected. The same Caspian Sea transit route used to deliver the S-400 components to Iran in late 2025 and early 2026 is reportedly the same logistics corridor identified in multiple previous assessments as the primary route for Iranian drone component deliveries to Russia for use in Ukraine. In other words, there is a bidirectional military-industrial partnership flowing through that corridor. Russia provides Iran with the S-400. Iran provides Russia with Shahed drone components and production expertise. Both sides benefit. Both sides have invested in that relationship's continuity, and both sides have demonstrated through the events of the past 18 months a willingness to absorb Western diplomatic pressure and economic sanctions in order to sustain it. According to sources inside the intelligence community, the trade relationship between Russia and Iran in military technology now represents the single most consequential non-nuclear military technology transfer of the 21st century. More consequential than North Korean missile technology transfers. More consequential than Chinese semiconductor exports, because it has just produced a battlefield result on April 10th, 2026, that no theoretical assessment or red team exercise had fully anticipated. And here is a dimension that deserves direct and honest discussion because it cuts to the heart of the long-term strategic picture. The United States of America has spent $398 billion on the F-35 program. $398 billion. That is more money than the entire GDP of Denmark. It is more money than the United States has spent on any military program in its history, adjusted for inflation. And on April 10th, 2026, a country operating under international sanctions with a GDP approximately 1/8 the size of California's, with a defense budget officially reported at $10.3 billion per year, that country appears to have neutralized the primary deliverable of that $398 billion investment, at least within a defined geographic envelope, using a combination of Russian hardware and domestically developed electronic warfare architecture at a total system cost of approximately $4.5 billion. The return on investment calculus of the F-35 program, already controversial for cost overruns and schedule delays, has just encountered its most consequential real-world challenge. And the defense contractors, the program office, the Pentagon leadership who stood before Congress year after year and defended that investment, they are going to have a very difficult set of questions to answer. What we are witnessing in the aftermath of April 10th, 2026 is something that historians of military technology will study for decades. Not since the sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse on December 10, 1941, when Japanese land-based aircraft demonstrated that capital ships without air cover were fatally vulnerable, overturning the battleship-centric naval doctrine that had governed sea power for a century, has a single military event so directly challenged a foundational technological assumption that an entire strategic doctrine had been built upon. The British Admiralty had known intellectually that the threat existed. They had war-gamed the scenario. They had written papers about it. They had not fully internalized it, not built their force structure around it, not adapted their operational doctrine to account for it until Prince of Wales went under, until Repulse went under, and in 3 hours, the age of the battleship ended. The question that defense strategists are wrestling with right now in Washington, in Tel Aviv, in London, in Tokyo, is whether April 10th, 2026 is the moment when the age of stealth aviation as an effective operational paradigm against a sophisticated adversary began its own reckoning. To be precise, this is not a declaration that stealth is finished. It is not a claim that the F-35 is worthless. The F-35's capabilities against second- and third-tier air defense systems remain significant. Against the vast majority of adversaries the United States and its allies are likely to encounter, the platform remains formidable. But against a peer or near-peer adversary with access to advanced Russian sensor architecture and sophisticated electronic warfare integration, The stealth advantage that was supposed to justify the program's extraordinary cost may be far narrower than its proponents have publicly maintained. And in strategic planning, narrow margins get people killed. Narrow margins lose wars. The United States Air Force has built its entire future force structure around the F-35 and the F-22, with the B-21 Raider and the Next Generation Air Dominance program still years from operational deployment. The near-term question, the question relevant to the current conflict in the Middle East, is what Israel does next without a reliable air penetration capability against an adversary that has now demonstrated it can hold Israeli aircraft at risk. Here is what happens now. Here is the warning that nobody wants to state plainly, but that the data demands. Israel faces three options, none of them good. The first option is a negotiated freeze, accepting the current military stalemate, pursuing the Islamabad diplomatic process, and hoping that the ceasefire holds long enough to develop countermeasures and restore meaningful air power capability. The risk of this option is that it concedes the initiative to Iran and potentially allows Iran to consolidate its S-400 network and further develop its electronic warfare architecture while Israel rebuilds. The second option is escalation toward ground-based long-range missile strikes, using Israel's considerable ballistic and cruise missile arsenal to continue targeting Iranian infrastructure without manned aircraft penetration. According to sources with knowledge of IDF capabilities, Israel possesses approximately 400 Jericho series ballistic missiles and significant stocks of the Rampage air-launched cruise missile. But these systems, while potent, are less precise and less flexible than air-delivered munitions, and they bring their own escalation risks. The third option, and this is the one that is reportedly being discussed in the most alarmed terms in Washington, is the nuclear dimension. Not Israeli nuclear use, but Israeli consideration of what its strategic posture means in a world where its conventional air power has been effectively neutralized over Iran. Israel has maintained a policy of nuclear ambiguity for over 60 years. That ambiguity is now being stress tested in a way that it has never been stress tested before. This is the deepest and most consequential truth about what happened on April 10th. It is not just a story about an aircraft being disabled. It is not just a story about a weapon system being compromised. It is a story about the architecture of deterrence itself, about the invisible framework of threat and counter-threat, capability and counter-capability upon which the stability of the most volatile region on Earth has rested for 3 decades. Deterrence works because the adversary believes you can deliver on your threat. On April 10th, Iran demonstrated to Israel that Israel's primary delivery mechanism, its air force, its crown jewel, the instrument upon which its offensive and deterrent strategy has been built, has a vulnerability that can be exploited. That demonstration does not just change the military balance. It changes the psychological balance. It changes what Iran believes it can absorb. It changes what Israel believes it can threaten. It changes every calculation and every back-channel conversation about the war's end state. The foundation has cracked. And when the foundation cracks, everything built on top of it begins to shift. The Islamabad talks are reportedly proceeding. Iran has accepted the 2-week ceasefire framework. The Strait of Hormuz is currently open, but the ceasefire is taking place in a fundamentally different strategic environment than it would have occupied 10 days ago before April 10th. Iran is now at the table knowing that its S-400 grid just stood down the Israeli Air Force. Israel is at the table knowing that Iran knows. The United States is at the table knowing that both of them know, and knowing that the $398 billion platform at the center of American air power strategy just had its most embarrassing day in its operational history. Whatever agreement emerges from Islamabad, it will be shaped by the shadow of April 10th, 2026, by the image of Israeli F-35s going dark at 40,000 feet, by the secondary explosions of an air doctrine imploding in real time. The doctrine of air supremacy, the article of faith that the side with the most advanced aircraft controls the skies and therefore controls the battlefield, is being stress tested in the Persian Gulf as we speak. It is being stress tested not by a theoretical exercise, not by a simulation, not by a red team paper, but by actual combat, actual aircraft, actual pilots in actual cockpits over actual contested airspace. The results of that stress test are not fully in yet. The Islamabad ceasefire may hold. The technical review may produce a countermeasure. The F-35 Joint Program Office may identify a software solution that restores the platform's effectiveness against the S-400 threat envelope. All of those things are possible. What is not reversible is the demonstration itself. What cannot be unseen is what Iran showed the world on the night of April 10th, 2026. The image of the most expensive aircraft ever built going dark over the Persian Gulf, and the sound of a $398 billion doctrine of technological supremacy beginning to answer questions it was never supposed to face. We will continue covering this story as the Islamabad talks develop, as the Pentagon technical review proceeds, and as the IDF Air Force confronts the hardest strategic questions it has faced in 50 years. Stay subscribed. Stay with us. The next chapter of this story is going to change everything. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of what is actually happening in the skies over the Persian Gulf, and why it matters not just to Israel and Iran, but to every NATO ally, every F-35 operator, and every American taxpayer who funded the most expensive weapons program in human history, then you know exactly what to do. Subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, share this with someone who deserves to understand what April 10th, 2026 actually means. Because most of what you are going to hear about this story in the next 48 hours is going to miss the point. We are not going to miss the point. Thanks for watching.